On an ordinary afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood, Mrs. Lillian Harris, an elderly black woman, was out doing her usual errands. She had lived in the area for many years, and everyone knew her as a kind, well-respected woman. The weather was warm, and she was in high spirits, picking up a few groceries for her household. It was a peaceful day, or so she thought. As Mrs. Harris walked toward her car, she noticed a police car pull up next to her. She thought nothing of it at first. Police were often in the area, keeping an eye on things. But what happened next completely shocked her. Two officers stepped out of the car and approached her. They didn't greet her with a smile or ask her if she needed any help, as they would with most people. Instead, one officer immediately began questioning her, asking her if she had been involved in a crime. Confused, Mrs. Harris shook her head. She was certain she had done nothing wrong. She had been out for a quick errand, and there had been no incidents or issues. But the officers weren't convinced. They didn't explain what crime she was suspected of, and they didn't show any evidence. They simply demanded that she answer their questions. Mrs. Harris, a woman of grace and dignity, tried to remain calm. She wasn't one to make a scene or argue with authority figures, so she tried to cooperate, hoping this misunderstanding would clear up quickly. However, the officers' questioning became more aggressive. They kept asking the same questions over and over, even though Mrs. Harris gave the same simple answers. It wasn't long before the situation started to escalate. One of the officers grabbed her arm roughly, and before she could even process what was happening, she found herself being placed in handcuffs. The suddenness of it all made her heart race. She had never imagined that she, an elderly woman, would ever be treated like this by the police. Mrs. Harris tried to explain herself again, telling them she was just an ordinary citizen running errands, but it felt like the officers weren't listening. It was as if they had already made up their minds about her, and nothing she said would change that. She could feel her frustration building. The officers didn't seem to care about her side of the story. They didn't ask for any identification or check to see if her account matched up with anything suspicious. Instead, they continued to treat her like a criminal. As Mrs. Harris was led toward the police car, she felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She had always tried to teach her children about respect for the law, about staying calm and collected in difficult situations. But now she found herself in a situation that felt completely unfair and frightening. It was a feeling she had never experienced before, and it shook her deeply. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of what would become a truly life-changing moment for her. As Mrs. Harris was being led to the police car, her mind raced with questions. What had gone wrong? How did everything turn so quickly from a simple errand to a situation where she was being treated like a criminal? She had done nothing wrong. She had been minding her own business, just like she had done countless times before. Yet here she was, being placed in handcuffs, surrounded by two officers who seemed determined to see her as guilty of something. Her heart was heavy, and a sense of worry started to grow inside her. She was no stranger to difficult situations, but this felt different. This felt unfair. She thought about her children, her family, and how they would react if they found out what was happening to her. Mrs. Harris had always raised her children to trust in the system, to believe that the law would protect them. But now, as she stood there in the cold grip of the handcuffs, she wasn't sure if that system was looking out for her at all. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew she had to keep her composure, especially in front of the officers. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She had lived through many challenges in her life, but this was something she had never expected to face. In her years, she had learned to stay patient, to pick her battles carefully. But this felt like a battle she couldn't afford to ignore. As the officers began speaking to each other, Mrs. Harris realized they were not talking to her anymore. It was as if they had already made their minds up. She was guilty in their eyes, even though they had no real reason to think so. They didn't ask for her side of the story, nor did they take the time to check any of the details she had given. Their focus seemed to be only on getting her into the car and off to the station. It was as if her words didn't matter at all. For a moment, Mrs. Harris thought about trying to argue with them, to demand to know what was going on. But she quickly realized that doing so might only make things worse. She had seen enough news reports about people who had been caught in situations like this, and she didn't want to be another story about a confrontation gone wrong. She just wanted to go home, to get back to her routine, and to forget about this whole terrible experience. But even as the officers led her toward the car, Mrs. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had lived too long, seen too much, to believe this was a simple mistake. This wasn't just a case of poor communication or a misunderstanding. She could feel it in her bones, the way the officers looked at her, the way they handled her so roughly. They weren't treating her like someone who deserved respect. They weren't treating her like a person at all. The thought weighed heavily on her, and she began to wonder how this could be happening. What was the real reason they were treating her this way? She couldn't understand it. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't just let this slide. She had to find a way to make things right, to clear her name, and to regain her dignity. It was then that a thought crossed her mind, a thought that might just be her way out of this mess. She realized there was someone she could call, someone who could help her get to the bottom of this and make sure she wasn't being treated like this for no reason. As Mrs. Harris sat in the back of the police car, her mind continued to race. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. How had things gone so wrong? She was innocent, yet here she was, trapped in this difficult situation. Her hands were still sore from the tight handcuffs, but the pain didn't bother her as much as the feeling of helplessness that had settled deep within her. She felt like she was being treated unfairly, and the more she thought about it, the more upset she became. But as the minutes passed, something in her mind clicked. She realized there was one person who could help her in this moment, a person who would not only understand the gravity of the situation, but also know exactly how to handle it. That person was her son, Sergeant Major Michael Harris. Michael wasn't just any son. He was one of the most decorated Green Berets alive, someone who had served with honor and bravery in some of the world's most dangerous places. He had faced life-threatening situations and had always come out on top. He had the kind of influence and reputation that commanded respect, and Mrs. Harris knew that if anyone could make the officers understand how serious this mistake was, it would be him. Mrs. Harris hadn't called him for help before. She had always tried to handle things herself, teaching her children to be independent and self-reliant. But this time was different. She felt completely out of her depth, and she knew that calling Michael was the only way to get out of this mess. As the police car rolled slowly toward the station, she gathered all the strength she could muster and pulled out her phone. With trembling hands, she dialed his number. The phone rang twice before Michael's voice filled the line. He answered with his usual calm, but when he heard the worry in his mother's voice, he knew something was wrong. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, his tone shifting immediately to concern. Mrs. Harris took a deep breath before speaking, trying to stay as calm as possible. "Michael, I need you," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been arrested, and I don't know why. They're treating me like I've done something wrong. And I haven't. I don't know what's happening." The moment Michael heard the word arrested, he felt a wave of anger and disbelief. His mother, the woman who had raised him with such care and love, was being treated this way. He could hardly believe it. But he knew his mom, and he knew that if she said she was innocent, she was. There had to be some mistake, and he would not stand by while she suffered. "Stay calm, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to take care of this. I'll make some calls, and I won't let them get away with this." Mrs. Harris felt a surge of relief wash over her. Just hearing her son's voice gave her the strength she needed to keep going. She knew that with him on her side, things would turn around. Michael was someone who had always been able to handle tough situations, and she trusted him completely. Now, more than ever, she needed him to step in and make things right. As she ended the call, she held on to the hope that Michael would be able to clear everything up. She was still in the dark, about why the officers had arrested her in the first place, but knowing that her son was on his way to help gave her the comfort she so desperately needed. In the back of that police car, surrounded by uncertainty, Mrs. Harris held on to one simple truth: she was not alone. As soon as the call ended, Michael Harris felt a sharp, immediate sense of urgency. His mother, the woman who had taught him to stay strong and believe in doing what was right, was now in a situation that seemed entirely unjust. He had always been protective of her, but now, as an adult and a highly decorated Green Beret, he knew it was time to step up in a way he had never done before. Michael's military career had taken him across the world, from intense combat zones to delicate peacekeeping missions. He had faced the most dangerous situations, but this was different. This was personal. The thought of his mother, an innocent elderly woman, being mistreated by the very people who were supposed to protect and serve, angered him deeply. He could hardly believe that something like this could happen in a place he had always considered safe. Without wasting a moment, Michael sprang into action. He knew that in this moment, his reputation and connections could be crucial. As a Green Beret, he had earned the trust and respect of many, including some within local law enforcement. He immediately started making calls, trying to reach the officers in charge, knowing he had to clear things up quickly before his mother's situation became worse. The phone calls were quick but purposeful. He started with the local police department, speaking to someone in his network, a fellow veteran who now worked as an officer. "Listen, I need your help," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "My mother has been wrongfully detained, and I need to know what's going on. This isn't right, and I need someone to make sure she's treated fairly." The officer on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment, processing what Michael was saying. "Sergeant Major Harris, I can't believe this. Let me see what I can do," the officer replied. "We'll get to the bottom of it, but hang tight." As the officer promised to look into it, Michael made a few more calls, each one urgent and full of determination. He knew he had to act quickly before things escalated further. With every call, his resolve grew stronger. He wasn't going to let his mother be wrongly treated, not when he had the power to do something about it. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Mrs. Harris was sitting anxiously, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She had no idea what was happening outside, and all she could do was wait. The officers had left her alone for a while, but the silence only made her more nervous. She had no idea what was going to happen next, and the uncertainty was almost unbearable. She kept reminding herself that Michael was on his way. She knew that if anyone could sort this out, it was him. His calm, collected manner and his experience in high-stress situations gave her confidence. She trusted him more than anyone else, and she believed that he would do everything in his power to make sure she was released, and the truth was made clear. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Harris tried to stay calm. She reminded herself to breathe deeply and keep her faith that this nightmare would soon end. Michael was working behind the scenes, and she knew that in time, everything would be set right. All she had to do was wait. As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Mrs. Harris sat in the cold, sterile holding area of the police station, her thoughts racing. She was still reeling from the shock of being arrested for no reason, and now she was left in this small, quiet room, alone with her thoughts. She didn't know what was happening outside, or if anyone was even working on her case. The officers had barely spoken to her since they brought her in, and she could feel the tension building with every passing second. Her hands were still aching from the tightness of the handcuffs, though they had been removed once she was brought inside. She could still feel the weight of the cuffs on her wrists, the reminder of how quickly everything had turned upside down. She never imagined that she, a woman who had always tried to live a peaceful and honest life, would end up in this position. The humiliation, the confusion, it was all too much. Mrs. Harris wanted to speak up, to demand answers, but she held back. She knew that raising her voice could make the situation worse. Instead, she focused on the one thing that still gave her hope. Her son, Michael. She kept reminding herself that he was on his way to help. He was someone who had faced dangerous situations before, someone who had the knowledge and the connections to get her out of this nightmare. She just had to trust that he would come through. Outside, Michael was doing everything in his power to make sure the situation was resolved. His calls had set things in motion, and he could feel the pressure building as he worked through his contacts. He knew that time was crucial. The longer his mother was held in that station, the more the uncertainty would weigh on her. She was probably scared, alone, and wondering what was happening. It hurt him to think of her in that situation. But Michael wasn't the kind of man to sit back and hope for the best. He was determined to make sure that his mother's rights were respected, no matter what. His calls had reached the right people, and he knew that the right authorities were now looking into the situation. Still, he wasn't going to wait passively. He kept in contact with everyone involved, making sure they knew just how serious this was. He wasn't going to rest until his mother was free, and the truth was out. Back at the station, Mrs. Harris was doing her best to stay calm, even though everything in her wanted to scream in frustration. She couldn't help but wonder why the officers were being so distant, so cold. They hadn't told her anything about why she was being held or what they were planning to do next. The silence was unbearable. She needed answers, but she knew she had to be patient. She had to wait for Michael to work his magic, to use his influence to make everything right. Then, finally, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Harris looked up, her heart leaping in her chest. Was it Michael? She hoped it was. She knew he would come for her, but the wait had been agonizing. As the door opened, a familiar voice called out to her, and Mrs. Harris couldn't contain the rush of relief that flooded over her. It was Michael. He had arrived. When Mrs. Harris heard the familiar voice calling her name, her heart skipped a beat. It was Michael. In that moment, the tension that had built up inside her for hours seemed to dissolve, replaced by a wave of relief. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding onto the hope that he would come to her rescue until she heard his voice. She stood up, her knees feeling weak, but she didn't care. Her son was here. The door to the small room opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway. Michael, tall and confident, his military uniform neatly pressed. Even though she had seen him in uniform many times before, this time it felt different. This wasn't just her son in his green Beret uniform. This was the person who had fought for freedom in places all over the world, who had led men and women through dangerous situations. This was the person who was now here to make sure that justice was done for her. She didn't need to say anything. Michael could see it in her eyes. She was tired, scared, and frustrated. She had been through a lot in the past few hours, and the emotional toll of the whole ordeal was written across her face. Without a word, he walked toward her and wrapped his arms around her in a protective hug. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly, his voice strong and reassuring. "I'm here. Everything's going to be all right." Mrs. Harris clung to him for a moment, feeling a rush of emotions she had been holding back. She had always been strong for her children, teaching them to face the world with courage and dignity. But in that moment, it was as though the weight of the entire experience had come crashing down. She allowed herself to let go for just a second, knowing that Michael would take care of the rest. After a few moments, Michael gently pulled away and turned to the officers who were still standing in the room. His calm, commanding presence immediately filled the space. The officers, who had been ignoring Mrs. Harris' requests for information, suddenly seemed more alert. They were standing a little straighter, and one of them stepped forward. "Sergeant Major Harris, we've been reviewing the situation," one of the officers stammered. "We understand there's been a misunderstanding." Michael didn't waste time with formalities. "A misunderstanding?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "My mother is an innocent woman. She hasn't done anything wrong, and you're going to fix this now." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They clearly understood that this wasn't just any situation. Michael wasn't just anyone. He was a highly decorated member of the military, someone who commanded respect. They realized that they had made a huge mistake, and now, with him standing in the room, they had no choice but to correct it. Michael's influence wasn't just based on his military rank or reputation. It was also the way he carried himself. He had been through too many challenges in his career to let something like this slide. He wasn't the kind of man who would let his mother or anyone else be wrongfully treated. And now, the officers could see that they had underestimated how serious the situation was. "I'm going to need an explanation," Michael said, his voice calm but unyielding. "And I expect my mother to be released immediately. I also expect a full investigation into this." The officers, realizing that they had no choice but to comply, nodded quickly. One of them went to make a phone call while the others stood silently, clearly embarrassed by how the situation had unfolded. Mrs. Harris stood quietly beside Michael, grateful that he was there to speak on her behalf. She had always known he was capable, but seeing him in action like this filled her with pride. As the officer returned, he confirmed that Mrs. Harris would be released immediately and that the error had been acknowledged. Michael's phone calls, his influence, and his reputation had done what they needed to do. They had worked, and now his mother was free. As Mrs. Harris was finally freed from the small, cold room where she had been held, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, and even a bit of disbelief. The entire experience felt like a bad dream, but now, standing in front of her son, Michael, she could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The officers had apologized, and they were letting her go. But despite that, she couldn't shake off the lingering feeling of injustice. How had something like this even happened? Michael walked beside her, his presence still calm and reassuring, but his mind was racing. He was glad that his mother was finally out of the holding area. But this was far from over. This situation wasn't just about the immediate resolution. It was about making sure that something like this never happened again. His mother had been treated unfairly, and it wasn't enough for the officers to simply apologize and move on. They needed to be held accountable for what they had done. As they walked through the station, Michael's thoughts were already on the next steps. He knew this wouldn't just disappear quietly. He had connections in the military, but more importantly, he had connections with people who cared about justice. People who would make sure that the mistakes made here would be addressed. He wasn't going to let anyone sweep this under the rug. Mrs. Harris glanced over at Michael, reading the determined look on his face. "What's going to happen now?" she asked softly, her voice filled with curiosity. She trusted him completely, but she was still trying to understand what came next in all of this. "We'll make sure they're held accountable, Mom," Michael said with quiet confidence. "This isn't over yet. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here." Mrs. Harris nodded, feeling comforted by his words. She trusted him. She had raised him to be a man of integrity, and now she was seeing it firsthand. She had always taught her children to do the right thing, no matter how difficult it might be. And in this moment, she knew that Michael would follow through on his promise. The car ride home was quiet. The tension that had once hung in the air had mostly lifted, but the events of the day still weighed heavily on them. Mrs. Harris was grateful for Michael's support, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process. She had always believed in the system, believed that the police were there to protect and serve. Yet today, she had seen a very different side of that system, a side that had almost cost her everything. Michael broke the silence. "I'm going to keep pushing, Mom," he said, his voice firm. "This wasn't just a mistake. It's bigger than that. I'm going to make sure this is investigated thoroughly. I won't let them get away with this." Mrs. Harris looked over at him, feeling a deep sense of pride. "I know you won't," she replied quietly, knowing that Michael's determination was unwavering. He had always been someone who fought for what was right. And now he was fighting for her. When they finally arrived home, Mrs. Harris felt a sense of peace settle over her. She was back in a place where she could feel safe, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Michael would continue to work behind the scenes, pushing for justice. He would make sure that this wasn't just brushed aside. And she would be by his side every step of the way. supporting him as he had supported her. As they walked through the front door, Michael took a moment to look at his mother. "You're safe now, Mom," he said with a soft smile, "and I'm going to make sure you stay safe." Mrs. Harris returned his smile, her heart filled with gratitude. She had always known that no matter what came their way, they would face it together. And now, after everything that had happened, she felt more certain than ever that they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. In the days that followed, Michael continued to make calls, pushing for answers. He had already made it clear to everyone involved that he would not let the situation go. As a decorated Green Beret, his word carried weight, but more than that, his sense of justice and determination fueled his mission. He wasn't just fighting for his mother's release. He was fighting to ensure that no one else would have to face what she had gone through. For Mrs. Harris, the whole ordeal was still hard to fully process. She had spent her entire life teaching her children about fairness and respect. She had raised them to believe in the goodness of others and the importance of standing up for what was right. But now, she had seen firsthand how easily those beliefs could be shattered. It was hard for her to accept that something so wrong could happen in the very community she had trusted for years. But she knew that Michael wouldn't stop until the truth was known. He was relentless, and in that way, he had always been her protector. He was her son, yes, but he had become more than just a son. He had become a force for change. Every conversation he had with officials, every person he spoke to, seemed to carry a little more weight. Slowly, but surely, the attention they had hoped for began to build. The mistake would not be forgotten, and the injustice of the situation was beginning to be recognized. Weeks later, Michael received an official apology from the police department. It wasn't just a generic statement. It was a heartfelt acknowledgement of the mistake that had been made, and more importantly, a commitment to reviewing and improving their procedures. They promised that steps would be taken to ensure that something like this would never happen again. Michael had ensured that the situation didn't just end with his mother's release. It became a catalyst for change. He had used his voice, his position, and his unwavering belief in justice to make sure that there was accountability. Mrs. Harris was thankful for the apology, but she knew that the process wasn't always as simple as it seemed. While she appreciated the gesture, she also knew that real change took time. It wasn't just about her. This incident had affected many others. The fact that it had been her who had experienced it didn't lessen the impact of what had happened. Her heart ached for the people who didn't have someone like Michael in their corner. She wanted to be sure that this mistake wouldn't hurt anyone else in the future. One evening, as Michael sat at the kitchen table with his mother, the weight of everything they had gone through started to feel like it was finally lifting. He had done what he had set out to do, but it was clear that the experience had changed him too. Seeing his mother go through this had brought back memories of all the other battles he had fought. But this one was different. It was personal, and it had shown him just how fragile the system could be. "You did it, Michael," Mrs. Harris said one evening, a quiet pride in her voice. "You fought for me, and you made sure they didn't get away with it. I'm so proud of you." Michael smiled softly, feeling the warmth of her words settle in his heart. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he replied. "You taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter what. This was just the first battle, but it won't be the last." And with that, they both knew the journey wasn't truly over. It had been a long and difficult road, but the fight for justice, for what was right, would continue. Michael had taken the first step, and with his mother's strength beside him, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, they knew they could stand tall against any challenge that lay ahead as mother and son, united in their commitment to justice.